Hi there, I hope you're well. If you're like me, you're just doing things to pass the time until the inevitable Diamond and Pearl remakes. Come on, just give it to us. But that aside, let's just hop straight into what's been done since the last devlog. In case you missed the first one, I'm doing a cyberpunk ancient Egypt theme for my first-person game, but instead of guns, there are cards. I started off by improving the UI a bit, making it smaller and adding some icons and stuff to the two bars on the bottom right. I think this design makes it look just a bit cleaner, and I'll know I'll have to tweak it in the future, but this is good for now. From there I needed to improve the movement system to make it just a bit more fluid. I changed the movement speed of the character and added an animation to play when you're walking forward versus idle. I tried to base the movement off of other first-person games, on how the arms and stuff move around. It kind of feels stupid to make all of these animations and models when I know they'll probably have to be changed later, but I digress. From there it was time to move on to some bug fixes from the last devlog. Because the held object was parented by the player and not the camera, I was getting some jittery rotation issues. So I switched the model to be parented by the camera, so it moves around smoothly now. The toon shader that I'm using wasn't properly receiving shadows from other instances of that same toon shader. So I rewatched the YouTube tutorial I definitely didn't steal it from and fixed that issue. Finally, I fixed the issue where the camera would fall through the head of the player. This wasn't too difficult, I just changed the height of the game object. I decided there's going to be 5 levels in the game, followed by a boss fight, kind of like Enter the Gungeon. But playing the same 5 levels until you beat all of them in a row can get boring. I think for now, the changes are going to be mainly in the enemies, the drops for enemies, and some different obstacles that can be placed around the map. The game was starting to emulate life's eternal loneliness a bit too much, so I decided to make an enemy for the game. This took way longer than expected. I started out with the concept of a jackal. I'm thinking the enemies are going to be infected with some sort of cyberpunk force, but I'm not really sure how that's going to pan out, so I just completely ignored that and made a regular jackal. I took a side view picture of a jackal and traced the outline in Blender. Extruding the outline, I modeled the rest of the jackal, filling in the legs and the arms. I haven't made a model this detailed before, but I'm fairly happy with how it turned out. There were a few hiccups along the way, but we made it through. From there I UV mapped the model and made a basic texture, but of course I forgot to save this, and had to redo it anyway later. Using a template from Blender, I set up the bones for the jackal. However, I screwed up where the bones went. This made it hard to do the texture weighting, where you tell the computer which bones move which vertices in the model. But convincing myself this is just placeholder art, I called it good enough for now. From there it was time to animate the jackal. I made animations for idling, running, and walking. I used reference videos of dogs doing these movements and figured it would be similar enough to base it off of. In the end, they're a little scuffed, but they'll do for now. I imported them into Unity and set up a transition between idle, walking, and running. From there, I needed to decide what kind of pacing the game was going to take on. I know I didn't want something slow like Metal Gear where you have to methodically plan out every movement, but I also didn't want something fast and in your face like Doom. Trying to find a happy medium, I think Breath of the Wild is a good place I'm going to look. Trying to hit the highs of rushing in somewhere and killing everything, while also leaving room for players to sneak around and be rewarded for doing so. This will be implemented later, but I think having this going forward is a good thing. With that in mind, I attached a nav mesh agent to the jackal, which lets it navigate around the world without running into stuff. I then added a script for the jackal's behavior. The jackal will switch between patrolling, chasing, and attacking. It'll patrol when it doesn't see the player. It'll chase the player once it goes within range, and then it'll attack if it's within a smaller attacking range. After getting all of those parts hooked up, this was the result. This framework of patrolling, chasing, and attacking will be useful for all enemies, so I set up the script in a way where I could use a scriptable object. That way, making enemies in the future will be a lot easier. Right now, it still doesn't take damage or deal damage to the player, but that's a later problem. To make spears not the only weapon, I went into Blender and modeled a shield for the player to use. This wasn't that hard to implement back into Unity, because I already had the framework set up for summoning held weapons. After the shield I went ahead and implemented projectiles. Right now they just travel at a constant velocity, but the code's there for something cooler. Using shader graph, I scrolled a noise texture over the alpha layer, making the outside of the sphere go in and out of transparency. I added particles and a cube in the middle, and I think it looks cool. I called this the Orb of Ra, Ra being the sun god of ancient Egypt. I think I want to add into the story how you're channeling the energy of the good gods, while the energy of the gods of evil are somehow affecting the enemies that you're fighting. Content with what I added, I started making this video. In the next devlog, I want to set up damage and attacking, making things die and get hit and stuff. I'd also like to set up an inventory system, and maybe make the enemies drop cars upon death. But anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next devlog.